So I'll briefly introduce the PSUR topic and make even briefer reference to the interfaces with risk management systems and developmental safety update reports. So the objective of this presentation really is to highlight the key changes to requirements for PSURs under the new legislation, and I think building on feedback that we've received, to provide an overview of the various sources of information and guidance for marketing authorization holders in relation to PSURs. And then finally, to briefly describe the possible interfaces with other pharmacovigilance documentation and ongoing work in the area of international harmonisation. So just to summarise, I think the key changes to PSURs relate to these following points. Colleagues this morning emphasised that the scope is changing. It's moving from an interval safety report that primarily focused on the presentation of information to a benefit risk evaluation report based on cumulative information. And that's a fundamental change that reflects changes in the pharmacovigilance environment. In order to facilitate this expanded scope, the format and content needed to change, and that's the reference to the work on international harmonisation. In terms of submission requirements, some of the changes we will see immediately and some of them will be more long-term. So in terms of the requirements for PSURs, this application of a risk-based approach is a first wave activity. You would be aware that the Union Reference Date list has been published. The move towards centralised submissions to EMA will be more of a second phase activity. Assessment procedures are changing with the involvement of the PRAC for the assessment of PSURs. And again, there'll be a slightly phased approach here. The new procedure will be initiated post-July for centrally authorised products, and it'll be a little later for nationally authorised products. The outcome of the PSUR is changing in that there's a strengthening of the link between the assessment and automatic regulatory action. And then all of this has been done in an environment or a context of increased transparency. So that's, I think, important to keep in mind. So where to get information? The European Commission's implementing measure provides the legally binding technical regulation for the format and content of PSURs. Public consultation was undertaken by the Commission. A draft has been published, but that it remains in draft form. In terms of guidance, which is the how-to guidance, that provides another layer of detail in addition to the implementing measures. This is provided in the GVP module 7, and a draft has been published for consultation, and that actually closed yesterday, and the final version will be clearly published before July, but as early as possible. The Union Reference Date list is what will control and manage the submissions of PSURs, and public consultation accompanied by an explanatory document, and that's quite important in terms of understanding what we're looking for in terms of input as part of that consultation, was launched on April 4th, and comments are due by June. And then finally, the ICH E2C Step 2 guideline, the public consultation in the EU was initiated on Monday afternoon, and comments can be submitted through to May 21st. So just thinking about some of the presentations this morning and the high-level objectives of the legislation, you may ask, how are these relevant to the more granular details, for example, around PSURs? Well, there is a strengthening of clarity in terms of links to assessment procedures and clear roles and responsibilities. There is a move towards making the evaluations more science-based, so moving from data presentation to increased focus on evaluation, moving from risk to benefit risk. I think the risk proportionality concept is also relevant to PSURs in that low-risk products won't have to submit PSURs at the same frequency. There won't be a routine requirement. There's also changes in terms of transparency and also in terms of the outcome to procedures, again, strengthening the link with regulatory action. So I know some of you will be experts and will be very familiar with this, so I'll keep this quite brief. But in terms of the evolution of the PSUR, the CMS2 guideline dates back to 1992. The E2C guideline reached step 4 in 1996, and at that time the focus was on interval safety data to determine whether product information needed to be updated. That really was the objective. There were subsequent refinements in 2003 to provide some clarification and an expansion of guidance to make it slightly more flexible, but it was developed as an interval safety report. Since that time, the pharmacovigilance environment has evolved. Clearly, the data sources that are available for pharmacovigilance have expanded. There's clearly much more of a focus on benefit risk evaluation in the post-marketing setting and integrating knowledge into optimization of knowledge of benefit risk, but that should be an input into benefit risk management. At the same time, the pharmacovigilance documentation has evolved in that, in terms of the ICH documents, in addition to the PSUR, there is the E2E document, so the safety specification, and in the EU risk management plan, and finally, most recently, the DSUR. So in the context of these changes and the need to consider that the fact that there's broad acknowledgement that the risks of a medicinal product are most meaningfully assessed in the context of their benefits, that this broad scope of the report changes to benefit risk. At the same time, there's been calls for more explicit evaluations of benefit risk, and the step towards a more structured evaluation in the PSUR is a move towards greater clarity in the post-marketing period. So in terms of the legal basis for this move towards benefit risk evaluation, that's provided in Article 107B of the directive, which highlights that PSURs will contain summaries of benefits and risks that will include the results of all studies, and importantly will include consideration of the potential impact on the marketing authorization. The evaluation should be based on all available data, and there's also some strengthening of the provisions around exposure. So in order to facilitate the change scope, the format and content needed to change, and the legally binding format and content is defined in the implementing measure. And as the colleagues have emphasised this morning, a draft has been published, but that version has been reasonably stable for PSURs. Further guidance will be provided in the GVP module, and that has been made available in draft form, and the final version will be available before July. I've highlighted just the structure as it's defined in the draft implementing measure. As you will see, a lot of the introductory sections look quite similar to the current PSUR. So some of the data presentation sections have been retained, but the scope has been amended. So for example, there have been refinements of the requirements, for example, around literature, late-breaking information, lack of efficacy, to focus more on lack of efficacy in controlled clinical trials. Then moving from the data presentation sections, there are clear evaluation sections, and these are signal and risk evaluation, benefit evaluation, and integrated benefit risk analysis for authorised indications, and this feeds into conclusions and actions. So that's the legal basis for the format and content. The format and content in the EU will be defined in the implementing measure, so it has a clear legal basis. However, we all appreciate that pharmacovigilance is conducted in a global environment, and there's clearly an interface with work on international harmonisation. So that's the link with E2C. Just to briefly give some background, a concept paper was adopted by the steering committee in 2010, and this indicated that the new ICH guideline should ensure that the reports have the role of being periodic benefit risk evaluation reports to include safety evaluation, evaluation of all relevant available information from all use, which is relevant to our earlier discussions, and a formal benefit risk evaluation. As I mentioned, the consultation has been initiated, and comments are awaited by the 21st of May. Just to explain briefly how the consultations interface, the GVP module, section B, the global section of the module is very much aligned with the ICH E2C R2 guideline. So if you've already commented through the consultation process, for example, on section B of the GVP module, a lot of the work is done for considering the ICH E2C guideline. Section C of the GVP module is more focused on operation of the EU network, so submission requirements, the URD list, the assessment procedures, outcomes, transparency, and also some principles around quality management. So moving into some of the detail now around format and content specifically, and some of the concepts that have been retained and some of the concepts that have changed. The retained principles are, in general, there's a single report for an active substance. There are some exceptions around this, and we have received one question that, for example, where there's products where they've the same active substances in very different formulations with very different indications. So, for example, a systemic and a topical product in completely different indications, we may use the URD list to indicate that separate PSURs are required, but it's more exceptional. And the ICH E2C guideline also is consistent with that. There's also reference to this in the implementing measure, so it'll be important to consider the final implementing measure on this point when it's available. In terms of reference information, the company core data sheet will still be retained as reference information, but it's the version in effect at the end of the reporting period. The idea of an international birth date and data lock point, that's still retained in the guideline, and that's clearly important in the context of global operations. And there's some practical guidance in the E2C guideline that isn't duplicated to the same extent in the GVP module, with guidance on managing different frequencies of submissions. Many of the existing data sections I have mentioned are the same. So what is new? It's benefit risk, it's cumulative. Something to flag up is that there's no routine requirement for line listings. During the assessment, if based on the scientific assessment it's considered necessary, there could be a request to submit line listings, but there's no routine requirement for line listings. And this isn't just linked to the fact that there have been major developments in the area of electronic reporting of individual case safety reports, or the developments in signal detection. That's clearly really important, but also taking into account that the focus of the PSUR has changed to become more of an evaluation document. The question is, how relevant is the inclusion of line listings? So where there's a request, it'll be driven by the scientific evaluation, but it's certainly provided for in GVP that this may be requested. Another important point to note is that there'll be no acceptance of multiple 6-monthly reports. One of the principles is that this will be a standalone document. It'll be an integrated benefit risk evaluation document, so we can't have slicing of data, so regulators won't accept multiple 6-monthly reports. There will be more structured evaluation based on cumulative data, but importantly no mandated, particularly quantitative methodologies for benefit risk assessment. So it's about more structure in the benefit risk evaluation and being more explicit about how conclusions on benefit risk are reached, but no mandated methodologies provided for within the guideline. Taking into account that it will be more resource intensive to produce these thoughtful benefit risk evaluations, the time interval between DLP, the data lock point, and submission has been expanded, and that's reflected both in the GVP module and in the ICH E2C guideline. Importantly, a modular concept has been introduced, and this is linked to the fact that the pharmacovigilance documentation have evolved. We now have a DSUR, a PSUR, and a risk management plan. Something to bear in mind, and many of you will be aware of it, is that PSURs and risk management plans tend to go to the same section of a regulatory agency, and DSURs tend to go to a whole different group of people. And if you also think about the activities of the PRAC will have responsibility for PSURs and risk management plans. So despite calls to merge any of these documents, it's really not practical or possible from a regulatory perspective. These documents have distinct objectives, and they're serving the purposes that they have different audiences and different objectives. So the effort is going into ensuring that this modular concept could improve the efficiency of the production, because it would allow for common sections to be used in different documents for submission to different regulators at different times. So the modular concept is to facilitate the utility of discrete sections of each document so that they could be reused potentially for purposes. The PSUR GVP module is broadly aligned, as I say, with the ICH E2C guideline. In terms of data presentation sections, worldwide marketing approval status, the guideline wording here is similar to that in ICH E2F. So this is the idea behind the modular concept, that there wouldn't be unnecessary distinctions made between sections of the guidelines where they could be possibly aligned. Actions taken in the reporting interval for safety reasons, again, the guideline wording is similar to that in ICH E2F. Estimated exposure and use patterns. There are two almost objectives in this section. One provides cumulative exposure in CTs, and that's similar in terms of its presentation to the E2F requirements. But then there's this requirement for cumulative and interval data from marketing experience, which is more like what you would present in a risk management plan. So providing estimates of exposure, but also providing analysis of how the drug is being used, so patterns of use, based on analysis of information from a range of data sources, not just from drug utilization studies. In terms of data presentation sections, the summary tabulations are for SAEs from CTs, the same as ICH E2F, and then for cumulative and interval tabulations from post-marketing sources, serious and non-serious adverse reactions from all marketing sources need to be included. So that's important. The summary tabulations will include serious and non-serious reports. So there won't be line listings in the PSUR, but there will be summary tabulations, and they'll cover both serious and non-serious. Summaries of significant findings from CTs, just the points to highlight here. The scope is similar to ICH E2F, but there is a requirement to provide a list of all CTs that are conducted as post-authorization safety studies, and that is new. Summaries of findings from non-interventional studies. Relevant safety information needs to be provided. So it's an evaluation of what is new and what is important in the context of what was previously known. And a list of all non-interventional paths needs to be provided. Additionally, there's a specific EU requirement that progress or final study reports are annexed to the document. In terms of the data presentation sections, there's a new section on non-clinical data. We briefly mentioned the literature section this morning, and that there's changes to the scope of the section on lack of efficacy in clinical trials, and late-breaking information is pretty similar. There's a new section on signals, and this is quite important. This is the data presentation section on signals, and it should take the format of a tabulation, and that tabulation is included as an annex to the E2C or 2 guideline. That also provides definitions of what is meant by new, ongoing or closed signals. And in the draft guideline, and emphasising that it's a step 2 draft guideline, and we're talking about a draft GVP module, there's an option for the MAH to present signals by interval or cumulatively. And this is just the signal tabulation. So they're the data presentation sections. As you can see, some of them are very similar to what we have at the moment. Some are amended in terms of scope, and then there are some new sections. Then moving into the more fundamental changes, there are the evaluation sections, and the first one is a signal and a risk evaluation section. The first section here is summary of safety concerns. So that's important identified risks, important potential risks, and important missing information. So you can begin to visualize how the modular concept would operate, because that's quite similar clearly to what we see in the risk management plan safety specification section. And the idea here is this first section would be what is known about identified risks and potential risks and missing information at the start of the reporting period. So that would be your baseline input into the PSUR. The next section would be your signal evaluation. The third section would be evaluation of risks and new information. And that would be evaluation of new information on previously identified risks. And this would be both what we call important risks and, I don't want to say the use the word unimportant risks, but I think those of you who are experts in risk management plans will understand the concept. And then the next section would be a synthesis of those previous three sections, what was known at the start of the reporting period, and then what is new in terms of important risks. And this section 4 would be important identified risks, important potential risks, and important missing information. And for products with a risk management plan, this would provide an input to a risk management plan update. There's additionally a section on effectiveness of risk minimization, and we would foresee that this could be a common module in many circumstances with the risk management plan. In the context of the PSUR, it's looking back and seeing what risk minimization measures have you implemented, how successful have they been in delivering on their objectives, and how does that contribute to your evaluation of the benefit risk profile. The focus in the risk management plan is slightly different because it's looking at planning. It's looking at updating your risk minimization measures. So here it's about evaluation. In the risk management plan, it's about planning, as the name suggests. The next section is benefit evaluation. And again, the idea that you look at what was known at the start of the reporting period is here. So you start by just summarising the baseline efficacy and effectiveness information. Then you consider the newly identified information on efficacy and effectiveness in approved indications. And then the third section becomes particularly important, where important new information on risks have emerged during the post-marketing period. Where risk estimates have changed significantly or important new information on safety has emerged, then there is a need to do an explicit and comprehensive benefit risk evaluation. So this is the re-evaluation of benefit risk that Peter Arlett mentioned this morning. And the idea here is that you integrate the baseline information with any new information, and that it should have a critical evaluation focus. It should be more critical analysis than just presenting information. So there's a risk evaluation section, a benefit evaluation section, and then the idea is that not all benefits and not all risks will contribute importantly to the overall benefit risk profile. So in this section, you bring forward the important benefits, important risks into an integrated benefit risk analysis for the approved indications. You'd start out by defining the benefit risk context. What is the medical need? Are there alternatives? And then consider the benefit risk analysis evaluation for each indication and where applicable population. So there's consideration here of the context of use, and I think the other point emphasises the need to be clear in terms of explanation of the reasoning used to reach conclusions on benefit risk, taking into account strengths, weaknesses and uncertainties in the evidence. Then finally, after doing the benefit risk evaluation, there's a conclusion, and that's for each indication and by subgroup where relevant. And this is traditional PSUR territory in terms of assessing the need to change the company core data sheet or labelling and to propose changes where appropriate. So that's really about routine risk minimisation proposals. You're talking about labelling changes. Additionally, you may wish to propose or make high-level proposals for additional pharmacovigilance or additional risk minimisation. And given that there can be some regional nuances around those proposals, we suggest that that would be incorporated into a risk management plan where the product has a risk management plan. This is for the additional risk minimisation or additional pharmacovigilance, or alternatively for products without a risk management plan would be included in an EU-specific annex to the PSUR. So in terms of the appendices, there's a signal tabulation, there's a listing of all paths, there's the list of sources of information used. That's currently referred to in the E2C guideline, but it states there's MAH discretion as to whether this is provided, and this is, as I say, is a draft guideline. And then the regional annexes are described here. I'm just going to briefly move on to the concepts that have changed. The other new concept that's very important, I think, is around risk proportionality. And the URD list is to support the application of a risk-based approach to submissions for PSURs. that's one objective, and the other is to manage the submissions. So the submission frequency would be variable, and the public consultation is clearly really important, because there are a number of scenarios where PSURs can be required, but the URD list will be the tool for providing clarity in terms of requirements to marketing authorization holders to ensure that there's predictability and also transparency. So just to summarise briefly, the 4 scenarios for requiring PSURs can be: 1, the default submission in the directive; secondly, according to the condition of the marketing authorization; thirdly, according to the list of union reference dates; and 4th, on request. I think the point to note and to reinforce today is that the URD list overrules the condition of the MA or the default submission in the directive. So in terms of managing different frequencies, there is some practical guidance in the E2C guideline, and it's largely based around the modular concept, whereby modules can be updated, taking into account that this will be a document based on cumulative data. And the point to highlight here is that some of the sections will contain interval data, and it's most likely that they will need to be updated. So if you're submitting to different regions at different intervals, they will need to be updated to take into account of the interval of the reporting period. The time interval between data lock points and submissions has been amended, has been expanded, and that's highlighted in both guidelines. The interface with the RMP is the final point. The PSUR is an evaluation document. The risk management plan is a planning document, but there is some overlap, and that's mainly in the context of the safety specification. We've highlighted in the GVP module, I won't go through them in detail here because it's quite involved and difficult to present on a slide, but there is detailed suggestions in the GVP module on which sections could be common. One of these relates to exposure, another relates to effectiveness of risk minimization, and then the idea around the characterization of risks. In terms of changes to decision making, the change for centrally authorised products will start in July, and then it'll be later for nationally authorised products. But the idea here is that you've got a legally binding outcome, and I think that's the point to highlight. When the single EU assessment starts, there'll be a more harmonised approach to the implementation of risk minimisation recommendations for nationally authorised products, in that the outcome of a single EU assessment will be legally binding on the member states. So the assessment report that is adopted by the PRAC would go to the coordination group. If there's no centrally authorised product involved, they would adopt a position. If they reach consensus, there's direct implementation in the member states. If they don't, then it's the subject of a European Commission decision, and which would be binding on the member states. So that's an important point to be aware of. There won't be a CSP in the future, but there will be an annex to the CHMP opinion or the coordination group position that will include the new safety warnings and key risk minimisation recommendations that need to be included in the product information. So there's still a focus on updating product information, but the vehicle wouldn't be the CSP. Transparency will be strengthened. The final assessment report recommendations will be made available, as well as the CMDH position or the coordination or the CHMP opinion. And that's the end. In terms of the implementation of changes, the dates to be aware of are the consultation dates, what will be available by July, the implementing measure, the GVP module, the draft URD list by July, finally to be adopted in the autumn. The assessment procedure will start for centrally authorised products by July, and for the single EU assessment, it'll be somewhat later. And welcome any questions.